Welcome to the Hammond-Harwood House Museum. My name is Joyce White. I am one of the museum's trustees and also happen to be a food historian. It is my pleasure to take you on a virtual tour to explain the meal tableau I created in the house's elegant dining room and to discuss the dining style employed in the early 19th century. Welcome to Service à la Française with the Lockermans. In 1811, Francis and Richard Lockerman moved into Hammond-Harwood House. The fashionable dining style at that time was called Service à la Française, or French service. This type of service consisted of 2 to 3 broad courses, served family style. Each course consisted of several dishes placed on the table in symmetrical neoclassical order. For educational purposes, I have recreated the first course of this type of meal to show how the Lockermans and their guests may have dined. In French service, when diners entered the dining room, they saw the table completely laden with the first course dishes. This could range from just 3 to 5 for a smaller, less formal family meal, to over 20 for more formal occasions. This bill of fare for July 3rd was published by John Simpson, cook to the Marquis of Buckingham. In his book called The Complete System of Cookery, published in 1806, Simpson gives dinner bills of fare for each day of the year. This book is an invaluable resource to use when constructing faux table displays in historic house museums. Here is another helpful example of a summer bill of fare from John Farley's circa 1811 cookbook, The London Art of Cookery and Domestic Housekeeper's Assistant. Farley was the principal cook at an establishment called London Tavern. The summer bill of fare I created for Hammond-Harwood House for a first course was based on these examples as well as others. Seasonality, local produce, and socioeconomic status all play parts in choosing appropriate dishes. However, museums are often limited in what can be depicted because faux food must be used, which is not always easy to find or make. Though the table is covered in many dishes, the first course almost always starts with soup before anything else on the table is touched. The tureen of soup is placed at either the head or foot of the table, along with a ladle and soup bowls for either the host or hostess to serve. He or she labels the soup into each bowl, which is then passed to the dinner guests, usually by a servant. For this table display, the chosen seasonal soup is called soup julienne, a vegetable soup whereby the vegetables are chopped in specific shapes, usually in the size and shape of matchsticks, but varied from recipe to recipe. This recipe has a long history. Here's an example of one from Eliza Leslie's circa 1844 cookbook, Directions for Cookery. Not only was the host or hostess expected to ladle the soup into bowls, he or she was also expected to slice fish and carve roasts placed nearby. A benefit to this dining fashion is that it gave diners something to talk about with people they didn't know who were seated near them, and thus served as a good way to break the ice. Conviviality at table is illustrated in this painting of the dinner party done by Thomas Rowlandson. At each table setting, a roll is placed in a napkin on each plate. The napkin is opened, the roll is removed and placed on a bread plate to make space for the soup bowl. The Hammond-Harwood House dinner service is incomplete, so this cannot be depicted as accurately as desired. Butter is served for the rolls. In this case, 4 butter molds have been created depicting bound sheaves of wheat. These faux butter shapes were made with a period-correct 3D mold. You can see how the 2 pieces are lined up with pegs to make sure the mold closes evenly and properly. Once the soup is finished, the tureen is removed from the table. The fish takes the place of the soup. Usually the fish is a remove. The term remove is used to indicate that the dish will be brought in directly from the kitchen and will take the place of another remove, such as the soup. Another acceptable way to serve the fish was to place it on the table with all of the other dishes, as is depicted in this table scenario. Though the fish is already on the table, it is still considered a remove because it is still served immediately after the soup. Soup and fish were best consumed as hot as possible, which explains why they were served in this way at the start of meals. For this table display, the fish remove is being interpreted as tamarind shad with carrots. Tamarind shad is a 19th century Maryland recipe found in Mrs. B.C. Howard's 50 Years in a Maryland Kitchen, published in 1873. In this dish, the sauce is made with tamarind paste. Tamarind is the fruit of the tamarind evergreen tree, Tamarindus indica. a seed pod that contains a fragrant but sour pulp. Tamarind is native to Africa, but spread to India as early as the prehistoric days and is now grown all over the tropical world. Tamarind was imported into Maryland in the 18th century. Here is an advertisement for it from a 1767 edition of the Maryland Gazette. Tamarinds are listed at the bottom, just under the name Thomas Wilson. Tamarind paste was used historically as a drink for the sick, but is also used in a variety of recipes, particularly in Asian dishes. Chances are you've probably had it and didn't even know it. If you have ever had an Indian or Thai curry, you've had tamarind. Tamarind paste is also a key ingredient in Worcestershire sauce. 19th century Marylanders probably adapted a fish curry sauce recipe into the sauce used to dress Chesapeake Bay caught shad. Because tamarinds are also used in African cuisine, it is possible that, if able, enslaved Afro-Marylanders bought tamarind and used it to add flavor to their food and to make a refreshing and restorative drink, such as this one found in the 1897 edition of the White House Cookbook. Moving on, in addition to soup and fish removes, high-status roasts, also called relevés, were served. As well as the dinner hosts, diners were also expected to help carve and serve dishes of food set near them in this very family-style type of dining. Luckily, cookery books offered advice for how to carve a variety of roasts. An example of this is found in Elizabeth Hammond's circa 1819 cookbook, Modern Domestic Cookery and Useful Receipt Book, a book Mrs. Frances Lockerman owned and used at Hammond-Harwood House. In this table scenario, the main relevés, or roasts, are roast beef with potatoes and country ham with red beets. Being the most impressive dishes, relevés are placed down the center of the table, taking center stage on the table. Flanking the relevés are the entrees. The entrees are therefore less important in status than the relevés, and are therefore placed alongside the relevés in a supporting role. For this table scenario, 2 entree pies are presented. These are the 2 raised pies being used to depict some of the entrees for this table display. We know that raised pies date to the medieval period because that is when they started to be written about. However, they most likely date back even earlier, when it was difficult to create written documentation. Early versions of these pies were made without a pie pan, but were hand-raised with very thick and strong pastry dough, such as the one shown here. Pastry for these pies is too thick and tough to eat. Therefore, when serving one of them, the pastry lid was lifted off and the contents were scooped out. Consequently, these pies were often called coffins. For example, here is a medieval recipe for a pork-filled coffin. It is from the oldest known written recipe manuscript book called The Form of Curry. It was written in about 1390 by the master cooks to King Richard II of England. This recipe is written in Old English, but notice the highlighted section instructs that the paste or pastry be made into long coffins. These pies were often very elegantly shaped and decorated with pastry garlands, leaves, flowers, or whatever the maker desired. Raised pies were still fashionable in the early 19th century and are still made in the United Kingdom. This raised pie was made using this very special and now hard to find decorative copper pie mold. This type of mold became popular in the Victorian period. A pie served in 1811 would not have been made in such a mold. Instead, it would have been raised completely by hand. I use this mold because I am not talented enough to decorate the sides of a pie in a suitably elaborate fashion. Using the mold is a bit of a cheat, as it is technically anachronistic, but it produces a pie beautiful enough to have been served to the Lockermans in 1811. It was typical to place an effigy of the contents of the pie on its top, such as a hare, rabbit, deer, goose, or, in the case of this pie, a swan. This could be done using pastry dough, or in some cases, wax models were sold for this purpose. The second pie is meant to contain a mixture of game, such as venison, hare, rabbit, turkey, pigeon, and pheasant, among others. This second pie was also made with a Victorian pie mold, though simpler, with the top decorated not with effigies, but with just leaves, another common period motif. The other two entrees on the table are lamb chops resting on a bed of sage with radishes and a simple roast chicken. Once the first course is cleared, the table is laid with the second course. While roast can be included in second courses, they usually consist largely of made dishes, savory entremets, and sweet entremets. This circa 1806 bill of fare for a second course exemplifies this exactly. The macaroni is a perfect example of a made dish. The poached eggs and ham, asparagus, and peas are the savory entremet, and the currant tart, jelly, and Savoy cake are the sweet entremet. Made dishes are a type of entremet whose recipe includes many ingredients and has a complicated cooking process. Examples of made dishes are braised beef ragout with suet dumplings as pictured here, assorted casseroles, fricassees, macaroni dishes, heads stuffed with forcemeat, aspics such as poultry and jelly, and many others. Savory entremets in a second course are smaller versions of entrees. This is where dedicated vegetable dishes like these fried artichoke bottoms are served. Other vegetable dishes include peas, Brussels sprouts, beans, salads, and pickles, among many, many others. Other examples of savory entremet include these fried oyster and veal patties, as well as a variety of other fritters, in addition to soufflés, egg dishes such as omelets, meat, game, or marrow pasties, and fish cakes, just to name a few. Sweet entremets are also served in the second course. It was typical in this dining style to serve warm or rich sweets with savory dishes. Examples of second course sweet entremet are plum puddings such as this dried peach pudding, warm baked rice pudding, fruit tarts such as this apricot and peach tart, white or sweet potato pudding in a paste, and cakes such as fruit cake, seed cake, or this Savoy sponge cake, among others. The final course was called the dessert course, but did not necessarily have to contain anything sweet. The word dessert comes from the French word desservir, referring to the understanding that the meal was ending soon and the table would soon be deserted. This is a circa 1812 dessert tableau I created at Riversdale House Museum in Riverdale, Maryland. Notice that the tablecloth has been removed. This was a customary practice. During the first two courses, tablecloths protected expensive wood tables from hot dishes, spills, and scratches. The dessert course was therefore a chance to show off the fine dining table, but for just a short portion of the meal. Another possible reason why tablecloths were removed for the dessert course is that the tradition is a remnant of the medieval void, one of the earliest known dedicated dessert courses in English history. A medieval feast took place in the great hall of a manor house, palace, or castle. This was a multi-purpose space that did not have a fixed furnishing plan. Things were moved around or removed depending on need. Once the feast was finished, all furnishings were removed to make room for after-dinner entertainments such as dancing, music, performances, etc. Only honored guests were invited to take place in the void or dessert course. Partakers of the void were made to stand while the tablecloths, tables, and chairs were ceremonially removed. Each person was then presented with a series of sweets placed on serving plates called roundels, such as the ones pictured here. The sweets served at a void include wafers, crystallized ginger, comfits, which are sugar-coated seeds and nuts, such as these sugar-coated fennel and coriander seeds. By the way, comfits are also referred to as sugar plums. Sugar-coated almonds are also referred to as comfits or sugar plums. In addition, here is another type of comfit called kissing comfits. They are flavored with spices to sweeten the breath. Oiled sweets, such as these hard candies called penadies, were also served at a void, along with the original marmalade made of quince, also known as membrillo. Void sweets were typically washed down with hippocras, a sweet-spiced wine. The wine gets its name because the spices were sieved out with what was traditionally called a Hippocratic sleeve, but we know it today as a jelly strainer. During the Lockermans' tenure at Hammond-Harwood House in the early 19th century, dessert was not always a lavish affair. Accordingly, dessert bills of fare were not usually printed in cookery books because dessert was mostly just a simple course consisting of fruit, as depicted in this beautiful épergne, cheese, and nuts, such as the walnuts and Brazil nuts, filberts and cobs, and almonds, as shown in this image. However, when dessert was meant to be elaborate, lavish bills of fare offered advice for ways in which to set it out, such as this example from a British cookbook from 1770. Examples of the types of sweets the Lockermans may have included in an elaborate dessert course include this exotic and tasty Parmesan cheese ice cream, mousse-like creams such as this orange cream, and other creams such as raspberry fool, a recipe Mrs. Lockerman recorded in her commonplace book of receipts or recipes. And gelatins such as this ribboned jelly dyed with cochineal, violets, spinach, and saffron, or this lemon blancmange, among many other confections. Of course, none of the meals served by the Lockermans were possible without the labor of their enslaved servants. Mary Matthews, Matilda Matthews, and Juliet are just 3 of the enslaved known to have been held by the Lockermans. The workload involved in creating these meals was immense, and a great amount of skill and finesse was necessary to create most of these dishes to the exacting standards dictated by the slaveholders. Of course, cleaning up after the meal preparation and service was drudgery, to say the least. Washing and scouring pots and pans with paper were just 2 of the many jobs awaiting house servants. The unfortunate circumstances of the enslaved are well illustrated in this depiction of a typical simple meal of the type usually available to the enslaved, consisting of salt-cured pork products, pork pie, sweet potatoes, greens, and hoe cake made of Indian meal or corn. This meal is obviously in stark contrast to the lavish dishes they made and served to the Lockermans and their guests. I hope you have enjoyed learning about service à la Française, the dining style fashionable when the Lockermans lived at Hammond-Harwood House. Stay tuned, because in the future, depictions of second and dessert courses will be featured on the dining table at Hammond-Harwood House.